This story follows a man who survived a flight that should have been ordinary, a trip to sunny Maui he had been planning for months. He had a bad feeling he couldn't explain, like a quiet voice in his head telling him not to get on, and he ignored it. The plane took off, but what waited in the skies above the Pacific was far from ordinary. What he thought was turbulence, isolation, and delay became something that hunted him at 30,000 feet, leaving him alive to tell the tale. Michael had arrived at the airport late in the evening, dragging a carry-on behind him, exhausted after a long week of work. He was supposed to be flying to Maui, somewhere warm, somewhere the sun would chase away the gray clouds of his life. But even before the flight, the place felt wrong. The terminal was almost empty, lights humming softly overhead, the kind of hum that makes the walls feel closer than they are. People were spread out in small groups, families shuffling with luggage, travelers staring at their phones, some pacing. A baby cried. Michael tried to ignore it at first, focusing on the departures board. Flight 423 to Maui delayed 2 hours. Then another announcement. Another hour. Every time the board flickered with the new time, something about it didn't feel right. The numbers looked sharper, colder, like the delay itself was alive. He rubbed his eyes, telling himself he was just tired. He noticed her then, one of the stewardesses. She moved with an odd kind of focus, brown hair tied back tightly, uniform neat and pressed, though the tiredness in her eyes gave her away. She passed the crying baby twice, slowing each time, bending slightly as she looked around the terminal floor, like she'd heard it before. And every time she came close, the crying stopped. Michael frowned. There was no stroller, no parent nearby, just a small sound bouncing in the empty space. She straightened and scanned the terminal. Her gaze swept past Michael for a second that felt longer than it should, sharp, assessing. The feeling settled in his chest. Someone, or something, was watching. People around him complained quietly, muttering about the delay. The screens flickered once, then again. The reflection of travelers bent in the glass seemed slightly delayed. Michael told himself he was imagining things. He had a plane to catch. He had a holiday to save. Still, when he looked toward the gate, he saw the man from the entrance, standing behind the glass, but nowhere in the reflection, completely still, watching. When Michael blinked, he was gone. The travelers looked even more worn down. A family pushed a cart past him, the little boy gripping a plastic dinosaur, the girl complaining about missing her show. Then the baby cried again, closer this time. Not from a stroller, not from anyone, just a sound in the terminal. Michael followed it with his eyes. It shifted along the hall, as if carried on some invisible current. The stewardess walked toward it again, pausing, tilting her head. The crying stopped. Nothing. She glanced around, then up at the ceiling, then at Michael. Their eyes met briefly, and she blinked, almost as if confirming something that no one else could see. He looked away, feeling the air grow heavier. Announcements came again. Voices over the speakers, flat and distant, as though coming from another room entirely. Flight 423 to Maui, boarding soon. Gate changing. Again. Michael followed the growing line of travelers. The jetway was narrow, metallic, and the lights overhead flickered, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move independently. He noticed the man again. Same posture, same vacant stare. Not moving, not acknowledging anyone. eyes too dark, teeth too white in the dim light. Michael shook his head, walking faster. Boarding passes were scanned. Michael handed his over, heart pounding with the mix of excitement and unease. The stewardess passed him, scanning rows, checking names, noting a seat not on the manifest. A flicker of her expression told him she had seen it before. She paused mid-aisle, glancing up, sensing something, though she said nothing. Michael took a deep breath and stepped into the plane. The hum of the engines was comforting, but only barely. The baby cried again, somewhere behind him, maybe even inside the plane now. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck. Overhead compartments clicked as if closing themselves, though the attendants were busy scanning passes. He settled into his seat. The man across the aisle smiled. Too long, too thin. The baby's cry moved again, following the stewardess as she walked the aisle, her uniform perfect, eyes scanning, alert, unaware, or pretending. Michael tried to focus on the window, the dull night outside. But then the tap came. 3 soft knocks from the walls themselves. Not random, measured, testing, waiting. Michael froze. He wasn't the only one noticing. A woman across the row stiffened, glancing behind her, to no one. The plane doors closed with a hiss. Michael felt the air tighten, as though the space itself had contracted. The stewardess stopped in the aisle, eyes up at the ceiling again. Shadows shifted, moving independently. The baby's cry rose, echoing unnaturally. The man across the aisle did not blink, did not breathe. Michael's chest tightened. Something was already inside, watching, waiting. The engines roared to life. The plane began to push back from the gate. The cry stopped abruptly. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Then the lights flickered. A shape moved in the aisle. Not fully there, not fully human, just a shadow. The stewardess stepped forward, calm, professional, but her eyes betrayed the first flicker of fear. Michael swallowed, gripping the armrest. The man across from him smiled again, sharper now, teeth glinting in the light. A passenger. "Did you feel that?" And Michael realized it wasn't just them noticing. Everyone was being watched, the plane alive with tension, a presence they couldn't see, yet could feel. As the engines hummed, as the plane climbed into the night, Michael closed his eyes for a moment, tried to convince himself it was the stress, the exhaustion, but he heard it again. Soft taps from the walls, measured, deliberate, waiting. And then the baby cried once more, somewhere behind him. And the plane, finally airborne, felt smaller than it had on the ground, as though the air itself had eyes, as though something inside had already made its choice. The line snaked through the terminal, longer than anyone had expected for a late-night holiday flight, and the fatigue hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on shoulders, making the hum of announcements almost unbearable. The stewardess, careful in her Navy uniform, moved along the edge of the crowd, clipboard tucked under her arm, eyes scanning for travelers who seemed lost or anxious. She had worked hundreds of flights, but tonight felt different. Something felt wrong the moment she walked past the gates, a subtle vibration in the soles of her shoes, like the floor itself was shifting beneath her, though no one else seemed to notice. The passengers were typical: tired parents juggling carry-ons, couples clutching tickets, college kids chattering in muted excitement. But there was a tension simmering underneath, a tiny unease that seemed to ripple through the air. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried. At first, she ignored it, assuming it was someone's infant struggling with the late hour, but the sound was strange, piercing, insistent, but somehow deliberate. Every time she moved closer, it stopped. When she turned to walk away, it started again, shifting locations as though it were not attached to any stroller or parent, echoing from row to row. She felt the hair on the back of her neck rise and her pulse quicken. Her colleagues noticed nothing. One of them joked about the baby being the ghost of Christmas future for travelers delayed too long, but she didn't laugh. Something was off, and she couldn't explain why. The screens flickered once, a blue spark crossing the flight information before returning to normal, and she caught the movement of a man standing behind the glass partitions near the boarding area. He wasn't reflected in the glass. She stared for a moment, trying to convince herself it was an angle, a trick of the light, but the sensation of being watched had her stomach knotting. Travelers shuffled forward as announcements repeated the delay for the 5th time, each word cutting through the terminal with a mechanical precision that grated against her nerves. People muttered, tapped phones, shifted weight from one foot to the other. The man behind the glass did not move. He did not blink. When she looked back a second later, he had stepped to the side, but the position was impossible to reconcile with how crowded the area had been. The boarding gate lights changed again, another gate reassignment. Travelers groaned. Luggage trolleys rolled awkwardly over seams in the tile. The stewardess adjusted her uniform, forcing herself to smile as she welcomed the next group of passengers, scanned their boarding passes, and tried to maintain the illusion of control. She noted a man who seemed to appear in multiple places as she moved through the line, always just outside her peripheral vision, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, never interacting, never talking, just standing. She shook it off as fatigue. It was late. Holiday flights were always a mess, but the uneasy pressure in her chest remained. She guided travelers down the jetway, checking seats, making small talk, directing people to the nearest restroom or overhead bin. Then the baby cried again, sharp and sudden, louder this time, bouncing from one row to another as if it were floating on some invisible current. She stopped in the aisle, trying to locate it, but the parents in row 17 were already settled, staring at her in confusion. "Excuse me," she said. "Where's the baby?"
The parents blinked. "We don't have a baby," one muttered, voice tight, unnerved.
The stewardess felt her hands go cold. The sound was close now, as if directly behind her, but when she turned, no one was there. The overhead compartments clicked and shifted, faint metallic taps that echoed in the cabin above the hum of the ventilation. She could swear a warm breath grazed her neck, the subtle exhale of someone just inches away, but she was alone. The scanner beeped sharply in her hand as the last boarding passes were checked. She noted the empty row at the back, seat 34F, a seat that had not appeared on the manifest when she verified the passenger list earlier. Someone, or something, was already sitting there, though the row had been vacant minutes before. Her pulse raced, fingers gripping the scanner tightly. Passengers filled the cabin, conversations low and uneasy. A man whispered to his partner about turbulence on the route ahead. A child giggled nervously. Somewhere, the baby cried again, now from the very rear of the plane, moving forward in bursts, always just out of sight when she turned. The stewardess tried to steady herself, telling herself it was a prank, a delayed boarding infant, some misalignment of seats. But then the seats themselves seemed wrong. A row she passed earlier appeared shifted, one armrest slightly higher, another slightly lower, as though the plane itself was subtly rearranging in real time. A flicker of movement caught her eye, an impossibly thin shadow sliding along the ceiling, just above the overhead bins. She blinked, and it vanished. The intercom crackled. "Cabin doors are closing," a voice intoned. The stewardess glanced toward the cockpit, noting that the pilot's face was tense, hands gripping the yoke with visible strain. The plane shuddered ever so slightly, a subtle tremor that ran through the cabin, but there was no announcement of technical issues. Her mind raced. She tried to reassure herself, calm the growing dread knotting her stomach. Boarding was almost complete. Everyone had found their seat. The baby's cry had ceased for the moment, leaving a hollow silence that pressed against the ears. The man in the back row, seat 34F, did not move. He sat perfectly still, hands on his knees, gaze forward, but when she passed, the shadow of his face seemed wrong, edges blurred, like an image not quite formed. She swallowed and continued down the aisle, checking seatbelts, helping an elderly passenger with their bag. Each time she returned toward the rear, she could swear he had shifted closer, yet his position never matched the angle she'd last seen. The plane's systems blinked once on the monitors, warning lights flickering and dying instantly. She glanced upward. The cabin lights dimmed for a second, just long enough to make her heart leap. The humming of the engines felt different now, vibrating lower, denser, as though the aircraft itself carried a pulse that had nothing to do with mechanics. Somewhere above, the overhead compartment clicked, then softly slid open, revealing nothing. She looked directly at seat 34F again. He was still there. No one else seemed to notice, but she felt it watching. A sudden cold brushed her arm. She spun, scanning the aisle. The seats were all full. Passengers murmured quietly. Nothing seemed amiss. And yet she could not shake the feeling, solid and unrelenting, that the air around her had thickened, charged with intent. The baby cried again, impossibly, behind the curtain of the rear door, then at the wing, then somewhere between rows 19 and 23. She froze, instinctively reaching for the intercom, but her voice would not carry. Her throat felt heavy. Another soft exhale tickled her neck. She whirled, scanning every shadow, every reflection in the small mirrors along the cabin wall. Nothing moved. Then, in the last row, a hand appeared on the armrest of 34F. Pale, wrongly long. The stewardess's stomach dropped. The man, or what sat there, smiled without moving the rest of his face. She blinked. The doors closed. The jetway rolled back. The engines hummed deeper now, vibrating through the floor. Everyone was strapped in, unaware. Everyone but her. She could feel it. Even in the distance, something had just settled, waiting. And when the plane taxied, the air in the cabin seemed to stretch, as if inhaled collectively by an invisible presence that had boarded long before the flight had begun. The plane had lifted off, engines roaring louder than any human voice could match, and the city lights below shrank into a blur, replaced by the endless stretch of clouds. The stewardess moved down the aisle, clipboard tucked under her arm, checking passengers, ensuring seatbelts were fastened, but her mind was elsewhere. The baby's cry had stopped, only to be replaced by an eerie, low hum that seemed to vibrate through the cabin walls. She paused mid-step, listening, straining to catch the sound, but it vanished when she tried to pinpoint it, leaving an empty, unnerving silence that pressed against the ears. The man in seat 34F remained perfectly still, eyes forward, hands resting on knees, but there was something wrong about the way his shadow fell on the floor. It flickered, sometimes too long, sometimes stretching across 2 rows like liquid, unbound by the lights above. Passengers whispered to one another about the turbulence, but it felt different this time. No announcement, no warning, just a shudder that ran through the plane like a pulse. The stewardess felt her stomach twist as she glanced toward the cockpit. The pilot's hands gripped the controls so tightly that his knuckles shone white, and his eyes flicked to the instruments with a tension she had never seen in her years of flying. Something was off. She could feel it. The hum returned, louder, now accompanied by a soft tapping that echoed above the passengers' chatter, coming from the ceiling panels. She stopped, staring upward, and for a fleeting moment, a thin, elongated shape pressed against the lights above, then vanished before she could blink. She whispered to herself, "It can't be. It can't be real." But her words dissolved into the air before anyone could hear them. A child in row 20 gasped suddenly, pointing at empty space, voice trembling. "It's behind us," he said. No one reacted at first, assuming it was imagination, until the stewardess noticed the slight sway of the empty aisle at the back. Something moved, just enough to disturb the overhead bins. A subtle click, a compartment door rattling ever so slightly. Her pulse quickened. She walked toward it, forcing her voice calm as she called, "Is anyone back here?" There was no answer. The hum became a low, vibrating whisper, like air passing through something immense, unseen, moving along the fuselage. The baby's cry started again, high-pitched, shifting locations faster than she could track, from one row to the next, always just behind her line of sight. Her fingers tightened around the clipboard, knuckles white, heart hammering against ribs. She tried to reassure herself, tried to tell herself it was nerves, the late hour, the long flight ahead, but the sensation of being watched gnawed at her like teeth against bone. A sudden flicker of the cabin lights made everyone flinch. Shadows moved where shadows shouldn't be. She looked down the aisle, and for a fraction of a second she saw it. The man, or whatever occupied 34F, was standing in the aisle, tall, impossibly thin, yet his uniform remained folded neatly on his frame, as though the laws of the plane itself were bending around him. The passengers continued unaware, murmuring about turbulence, clutching drinks, reading screens, none of them noticing the cold that swept the aisle. She swallowed hard, stepping closer, and the baby's cry followed her, echoing in every direction at once. She turned sharply. The last row was empty. Seat 34F sat exactly as it had, but a faint pale handprint glimmered on the wall beside it, like condensation on glass, though there was no moisture anywhere. The cry stopped. The aisle was empty again. She felt breath against her neck, soft, deliberate, too warm and too close, but when she spun, the aisle remained empty. The plane shuddered again. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but forced, announcing minor turbulence ahead, though she knew from the instruments that nothing should have caused such vibrations. Another flicker of light, and the shadow in the ceiling panels shifted again. She could see it, moving fluidly, almost as if the panels themselves bent around it, an elongated, impossible form that defied logic. She forced herself to move down the aisle, checking passengers, trying to reassure herself that all was normal. The child still pointed, now directly at her, eyes wide. "It's behind you," he whispered, voice barely audible. She turned, and the aisle seemed to stretch, the lights elongating the shadows into something unrecognizable. Another soft tapping came, this time from beneath her feet, vibrating through the floor. She froze. The engines hummed, the plane thrummed with the vibration of wings slicing through the air. But this was different. A separate heartbeat beneath her, faint, rhythmic, something alive and moving. She approached the cockpit to check on the pilot, her uniform brushing against her arms, sticky with sweat she hadn't noticed. He glanced at her once, eyes wide, a flicker of fear passing briefly before he focused on the instruments again. The intercom crackled or returned, but not with the pilot's voice. A whisper echoed softly, unmistakable, drawing her attention back to the cabin. She froze. The baby cried again, but this time it was accompanied by a second voice, soft, mirroring hers. Her own name, whispered from the vents. She felt ice crawl up her spine. She spun down the aisle. Everything was normal. Passengers were asleep or staring at screens. Nothing moved, yet she knew it had shifted somewhere along the cabin. She felt the warmth of breath again at her neck, fleeting, teasing, an invisible presence weaving around her. The plane shuddered sharply. A warning light blinked in the cockpit. She glanced upward at the exterior camera monitor. For the first time, the screen flickered on. There it was, something clinging to the fuselage, long, impossibly thin, limbs bending around the metal frame, head turned in her direction. It smiled. Not a human smile. Impossible angles, teeth too long, too many. Its gaze seemed to pierce through the plane itself, studying her, marking her. The monitor cut out. Static hissed. The cabin lights flickered violently. The baby's cry escalated to a scream, bouncing from the front to the rear, echoing in impossible timing. Passengers murmured in confusion. She turned to calm them, to insist everything was fine, but the aisle was empty. Not a single person had noticed anything wrong. The temperature dropped. Her uniform clung to her skin as sweat turned cold. The overhead bins clicked again, this time opening slightly. Nothing fell, nothing moved visibly, but the sound resonated like fingernails tapping a door. She could hear something breathing. Behind her, beneath her, within the walls. Each breath a low, deliberate exhale, synchronized with the plane's own engine hum, yet distinctly separate, alive. She stepped down the aisle, heart hammering, hands trembling, trying to maintain composure, to keep the passengers calm. She felt fingers brush her shoulder, cold, hard. She whipped around, nothing. Seat 34F remained empty, untouched. The baby's cry stopped. Silence. Then, from behind, soft knocking, rhythmic, deliberate, coming from the wall panels along the left side of the plane, a pattern too deliberate to be random. She froze, breath shallow, eyes wide, scanning each passenger, each overhead compartment, each shadow. Something had boarded the plane with the passengers. Something was watching, studying, waiting. The intercom crackled again, static whispering her name, her own voice repeating back at her. She felt the weight of the presence press against her chest, the cabin shrinking, walls bending in imperceptible ways. She knew, without a doubt, that nothing on this plane was entirely human anymore, that whatever had boarded was now part of the aircraft, the air, the very hum of the engines. And when the lights flickered again, she caught a glimpse of the shadow in the ceiling panels, long, stretching across rows, limbs bending in ways they should not, staring at her with those impossible teeth, and then vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The plane hummed, the baby cried, the cabin lights flickered, the pilot's monitor blinked a warning she couldn't decipher. The stewardess swallowed, gripping the clipboard so tightly her knuckles whitened. The air was thick now, alive, watching, waiting, and in the back of the cabin, seat 34F remained empty. But she could feel it, somewhere behind, somewhere beyond, studying, and when she blinked, the handprint appeared on the wall beside it, faint, pale, wrong, and she knew the real nightmare was only beginning. The cabin lights flickered once more, the hum of the engines now accompanied by a low, rattling vibration that seemed to come from outside, yet it resonated inside every row of seats. The stewardess pressed her palm to the cool metal wall, trying to steady herself, heart hammering as the baby's cry echoed somewhere in the rear of the plane. She could feel it moving with her, shifting across rows, faster than anyone could walk. She glanced at the cockpit door, noticing the pilot's monitor blinking erratically. Something had activated the exterior cameras. The screens flickered to life one by one, and she leaned closer, recognizing the angle of the fuselage from the outside. The first shot showed nothing but the curve of the wing and the endless black sky, yet she felt the hair on her neck rise. Then a shape appeared, long, thin. It clung to the metal as though gravity itself had no hold over it. Limbs bent in unnatural ways, hands gripping rivets, fingers impossibly long, head turned toward the cockpit, staring. It smiled. That wrong, impossible smile, and for a heartbeat, she swore it winked. Her stomach dropped. She jerked back, muttering a quiet, terrified prayer. The monitor cut to static. Then another flicker, and the creature moved, crawling along the fuselage toward the landing gear. Its thin body squeezed into the small spaces beneath the wheels, limbs stretching and folding where no limbs should. It peeked into the cockpit camera, and the pilot's knuckles whitened as he pointed, voice choking. "It's looking at us!" The stewardess stepped back, heart racing, gripping the clipboard so tightly she thought she might crush it. She could hear soft tapping now from the plane's walls, a knocking, deliberate, answering every movement the creature made outside. Each tap echoed in her ears like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. Passengers murmured in confusion, some rubbing their eyes, some glancing at screens, oblivious. She knew she couldn't make them understand. She moved down the aisle, noticing seat 34F again, empty, untouched. Yet she could feel it, somewhere behind her, a presence, watching, breathing, waiting. She swallowed hard and glanced back at the monitors, the screens flickering again to reveal a new angle. The entity's head popped into view, impossibly thin, skin pale, eyes black and wide, teeth glinting in the reflection of the camera lens. It smiled again, wider this time, stretching impossibly across its face. The cockpit monitor went blank, static filling the screen. She ran a hand along the aisle rail, trying to ground herself. The baby's cry escalated, bouncing from row to row, but it wasn't a baby anymore. It was a mimic, a sound that came from nowhere, everywhere, following her, mocking her. She felt a brush of air along her cheek, subtle, deliberate. Nothing was visible, yet the sense of being stalked pressed in on her from all directions. She glanced upward. The overhead bins clicked, one swinging open slightly, then snapping shut. The knock came again from the cabin walls, and she realized the pattern matched the movement of the entity outside, almost as if it was sending a message through the plane itself. She could feel it learning, understanding, communicating in ways she couldn't comprehend. The hum in the engines shifted, subtle, an undertone beneath the roar, as if the plane itself had become a part of it. She turned to the monitors again, a new angle. It was on the wingtip, thin fingers gripping the metal, leaning to peer through the fuselage. The curvature of its spine was impossible, bending against physics. Then it let go, dropped down the side, and for a fleeting second, she swore it looked straight at her through the cabin windows. The lights flickered violently. The baby screamed. A passenger in row 12 yelped, eyes wide, pointing at the empty aisle. She ran toward them, trying to calm the situation, but the presence behind her grew heavier, thicker, almost tangible, brushing against her uniform, cold, weightless, yet pressing. She could feel every step the entity took outside, synchronized with the soft tapping in the cabin walls. A low whisper came from the intercom, not her name this time, but words she couldn't understand, guttural, twisted, as if language itself had been distorted. The overhead light above 34 feet flickered. She turned to look, and the empty seat suddenly felt alive. A shadow flickered across it, stretching and folding into impossible angles, then vanished. She blinked. The exterior camera flickered back on the monitors. Another angle. This time it was closer to the landing gear, and she could see its head turn, as if aware of every cabin movement, every nervous twitch, every pulse of fear. It smiled again, impossibly, unnaturally. She stumbled back toward the galley, gripping the counter, trying to steady her breath. But the knocking in the walls accelerated. Then a soft scrape from above, from the ceiling panels. Something was moving inside the walls, mirroring the entity outside, shifting silently along the metal frame. The baby's cry stopped. Silence, thick and suffocating. She froze, heart racing. The lights dimmed. Static filled the monitors. When they flickered back, the camera outside was gone. The wingtip was empty, the landing gear clear. The plane's surface, as far as she could see, was clean, empty, normal. Yet she knew it was still there, watching, studying, waiting. Her stomach churned as the plane continued to hum along its course, engines roaring, wings slicing through clouds, passengers oblivious. The intercom whispered again, low, indecipherable. But she recognized the timbre, the cadence. It was breathing her, mimicking, waiting. A soft tap on the cabin wall near 34F. She froze. Then another. And another. She realized, with a shiver that traveled from her toes to the base of her skull, that the plane itself had become a conduit. The entity outside and the unseen presence inside, one and the same. A living shadow folded around the metal. Her fingers trembled. The baby's cry returned, high-pitched, moving along the aisle as if propelled by unseen hands, echoing through the cabin. She turned to the cockpit, eyes wide. The pilot's monitor flickered again. Another angle of the plane's exterior. The entity was gone. But the tapping in the walls continued. Her pulse quickened. The baby cried again, closer now, as if right behind her ear. She tried to move, but her legs felt leaden. The shadow in the aisle seemed to stretch, elongating, flickering across the floor, unseen by all but her. The lights stuttered once more, and she caught movement in the reflective strip along the ceiling panels. Thin, fast, impossible. A whisper from the intercom, her name, drawn out, hollow, mocking. She glanced down the aisle at 34F, empty. Yet she could feel the presence there, crawling along the seat, brushing against the metal. The tapping in the walls stopped. Silence. Then one loud, sharp knock directly above the galley. The plane shuddered. Engines hummed, higher, vibrating in resonance with something unseen. Her breath caught. The baby's cries stopped. All was still. And she knew, without a doubt, whatever had boarded the plane was no longer outside or inside. It was the plane. It was the hum of the engines, the vibrations through the metal, the empty aisles, the flickering lights, the whispering intercom, the baby's cry, the shadow in 34F, all one entity, folded into the aircraft itself, patient, waiting. The baby's cry started again, soft at first, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the cabin, bouncing off the walls and ceiling, impossible to locate. The stewardess froze mid-step, hand pressed to the back of a seat, stomach twisting with dread. She turned slowly, scanning the aisle, rows of passengers murmuring in confusion, some glancing back, others staring at their own phones, pretending nothing was wrong. The cry moved, shifting closer, faster than any child could crawl, settling briefly behind a passenger in row 12 before vanishing entirely. She moved cautiously, her footsteps muted against the carpet, but every movement seemed to trigger it, the sound tracking her as if aware of her fear. She called softly, "Is there a baby here?" But no one responded, only murmurs and nervous glances. The cry rose in pitch, then dipped into a low, almost guttural tone, twisting into something unnatural, something human but not human. She pressed her hand to the cabin wall, trembling, feeling the vibration of the sound, a pulse almost like a heartbeat, and then she saw it.
Nothing there. She blinked. The shadow lingered, elongating, stretching along the floor, as if the light itself had been bent by some unseen presence. The baby cried louder, echoing through the overhead compartments, a sound that seemed to pierce the air ducts, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. A passenger reached for their seatback screen, thinking it might be a speaker issue, but the screen remained dark. She moved down the aisle, trying to reassure herself, trying to ground herself in routine, the way she had been trained to calm passengers. The cry shifted again, now behind her, closer, brushing the nape of her neck with a sensation colder than ice. She spun around. Empty. Nothing. Yet she could feel it. Breath on her neck, a tiny hand brushing her hair, a gentle pressure that made her heart stutter. Another passenger shouted, "Someone's back there!" and pointed at empty seats. The stewardess ran a hand over the armrest. The seats were empty. Yet the crying continued, bouncing along rows as if propelled by invisible hands, traveling faster than any person could. Her own voice caught in her throat when the intercom whispered, low and twisted, "Follow the sound. Follow it." Row 34F glimmered, the empty seat now warped, stretched in the flickering lights. Something unseen pressed into it, moving, breathing, crawling along its contours. The baby cried, louder, warping, screaming, mimicking, echoing through ducts and ceiling panels. She realized the sound wasn't coming from a child. It wasn't coming from a speaker. It was coming from the cabin itself, as if the plane had become the vessel, the amplifier for something that had boarded it and refused to leave. The stewardess fell to her knees, hands trembling, the wail surrounding her, pressing, mocking, bending her mind. Passengers screamed, scattered across rows, gripping seats, eyes wide. She tried to calm herself, tried to shout over the noise, but her own voice sounded wrong, alien. The cry split, doubled, echoed, and multiplied, racing along the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the seats. She realized with a shiver that wherever she moved, it followed, it anticipated. It mirrored her panic, feeding on it, learning from it. The lights flickered again. The baby cried directly behind her, a cold brush of air along her neck, a whisper in her ear. "Don't leave me." She screamed, spinning. The seat was empty. The aisle was empty. The plane continued to hum, engines roaring, yet the sound pressed into her skull, filling every hollow space. She dropped to the floor, covering her ears, but the cry penetrated, morphing, mutating, echoing along the metal, along the walls, along the seats, replicating voices, laughter, sobs, her own words. It settled briefly, then rose again, a cacophony of impossible tones, unceasing, omnipresent. She realized the truth. There was no baby. There was no child. There was only the plane. And it was crying. She spun around, and the aisle behind her was empty. Silent. Too silent. Until the crying started again. Not a baby on anyone's lap. Not a stroller. Nothing but the sound, moving forward, backward, following her with impossible intelligence, echoing off the walls, then stopping suddenly, leaving a ringing in her ears.
A luggage compartment popped open overhead, and something long, thin, almost skeletal slithered out, barely visible in the dim light, moving along the ceiling with deliberate, predatory patience. And the moment it touched the panels, the lights above her shattered entirely, plunging her into darkness so thick she felt the plane close in around her, crushing, and she couldn't breathe without hearing something panting softly behind her. She ducked beneath a seat as the floor groaned and shifted, the metal bending like rubber, and when she peeked up, passengers she hadn't seen before were standing in the aisles, frozen, watching, faces blurred, eyes too big, and she recognized the uniform of one of them, hers, or a perfect copy, but the face was wrong, elongated, empty where a mouth should have been, and it lifted a hand as if to beckon. She ran again, pushing through the twisting cabin, and the crying followed, moving faster than she could track, passing through walls, through doors, and suddenly the galleys were gone, replaced with endless rows of seats, stretching back and up as though gravity had flipped, the cabin infinite, yet still entirely the same plane. Overhead screens flickered on in sequence, showing scenes she hadn't seen before. The runway dissolving, clouds thickening impossibly, strange figures climbing on the fuselage outside, long, spindly limbs gripping rivets, peering in through windows, and one of the figures turned directly toward her, impossibly, and she could feel its awareness, like it knew every step she would take before she took it. She ducked again, slid beneath seats, and every passenger she passed vanished mid-motion. Their screams swallowed into the cabin air, leaving only warmth in the seats, subtle breathing where no lungs existed, and the hum rose to a frequency that pressed on her eardrums, vibrating through her skull, the plane itself seeming to pulse beneath her, alive, aware, patient. She crawled to the rear galley, hoping to find the emergency exit, the hatch, something stable, but the door slammed shut in front of her, not by wind, not by mechanical error, but as if something had grabbed it from the other side, invisible yet firm, deliberate. She pounded, screamed, tried to twist the handle, and the crying returned, louder now, surrounding her, bouncing, circling, always a few steps ahead, impossible to reach, impossible to pinpoint. And she realized the sound wasn't random. It was guiding her, herding her like prey. Somewhere behind her, a seatbelt clicked, pulled taut, though no one was sitting there. She ripped it free and ran, and the lights flickered back briefly, revealing a passenger standing in the aisle, perfectly still, looking straight at her, smiling wrong, and then gone the instant she blinked. The hum slowed, deepened, each throb echoing like a heartbeat from beneath the plane, vibrating into the floor, walls, ceiling, and her body, and she felt that the entity was no longer just around her, it was inside the plane, inside the cabin, inside every breath, every sound, every shadow. She reached the cockpit, hoping to see the pilots, but the door rattled violently. No hinges, no locks, just a vibration in the metal as if the plane itself was resisting her entry. Then the crying stopped entirely, and the silence was heavier than the noise had ever been, and she knew it wasn't safe to breathe, to blink, to move, because whatever had claimed the plane, whatever had been patient, deliberate, and calculating since the moment it took off, was watching, waiting, and could imitate everything inside the cabin, could become anyone, everything, anywhere. And the stewardess realized in horror that she was no longer leading passengers through the plane. The plane itself was leading her, and wherever it intended to go, she had no choice but to follow, and every instinct in her body screamed that escape wasn't a possibility, only endurance, only staying just one step behind whatever had taken hold of the flight. The plane shuddered once, then glided into a strange calm, an eerie stillness that made the stewardess press her back against the wall, every nerve screaming, every muscle taut. But the hum of the entity inside the cabin didn't stop, only slowed, a subtle vibration beneath the floor she could feel in her bones. Through the tiny cockpit window, she could see the runway lights stretching endlessly, too perfect, too bright, like something had repainted reality just for them. The pilots were silent, faces pale, eyes wide, and when she called out, her voice echoed oddly, bouncing off the walls, returning warped, and one pilot's head twitched almost involuntarily toward the aisle behind her,
where nothing should have been. Passengers clutched their armrests, silent now, staring straight ahead, faces drained of expression, as if the plane had removed any trace of their humanity while keeping the shells intact. She moved down the aisle, careful, and every step caused the lights to flicker. Every step made a distant door slam. Every step echoed with the faintest whisper of a laugh, high, short, deliberate, coming from above the overhead bins. Outside the windows, figures clung to the fuselage, impossibly long, impossibly thin, stretching across rivets, peering inside, turning their heads in unison to watch her, and one leaned close to the glass, pressing what looked like a face, mouth stretching further than physics allowed, and she could feel its gaze like a finger tracing her spine. She ran, moving past passengers who weren't sitting anymore but frozen mid-action. One leaning over to grab a bag that wasn't there, another staring at a screen showing a different aisle entirely, the same seats but rearranged, multiplied, folding into themselves. A hand brushed her shoulder, cold, insistent, and when she spun, nothing was there, yet a seatbelt snapped around the empty chair beside her, tightening, pulling, restricting, and the crying started again, baby-like, high-pitched, moving with intelligence, skipping across rows, following her with precision. She reached the rear exit doors, relief momentarily rising, but the panels vibrated violently, not mechanical, not electrical, but alive, like the plane itself was aware she'd made it this far, and the hum surged, low, deep, resonant, almost like laughter from inside the metal. The overhead screens all turned on, displaying her own face from multiple angles, watching her, moving closer to the screen, lips parting impossibly, one figure climbing inside the display, reaching out, and she ducked instinctively, the crying stopping instantly, replaced by a heartbeat-like pulse through the cabin, synchronized with her own rapid pulse. The captain announced over the distorted intercom, voice calm but flat. "We are landing." But she didn't trust him. Not the voice, not the calm, not the plane itself, because every syllable felt like a lie, a trap, a countdown. The wheels touched the runway with barely a sound, but the runway lights warped and stretched, fading and multiplying, and emergency vehicles she knew were waiting were there but twisted, some hovering, some crawling along wheels that didn't exist. And she caught glimpses of figures among them, impossibly tall, impossibly thin, faces hidden, but movement precise, predatory. She sprinted down the aisle, checking on passengers. Some were gone, some were there but frozen, and each time she turned a corner or passed a seat, the crying or laughter or whispering moved just ahead, guiding her, herding her toward the front, toward the exit, toward the cockpit. The plane slowed to a complete stop, engines humming softly, but the air inside still vibrated with something unseen, brushing against her neck, slipping through the folds of her hair, cold and deliberate. The cockpit camera flickered on by itself, showing the fuselage outside, and there it was, long, thin, clinging to the metal, crawling along rivets, smiling directly at the camera, unblinking, its head tilting toward her. She realized with a growing, icy horror that it hadn't left, hadn't followed them to the airport. It had always been inside, waiting, patient. And now it could move anywhere it chose, anywhere inside the plane, anyone inside, and she had no control. Emergency crews opened the doors, lights flooding the cabin, but she saw the shadows first, elongated, moving wrong, stretching along the aisles, brushing past passengers who were screaming now, but the sound felt hollow, wrong, like echoes of people who had never existed. The crying started again, faint, distant, coming from the direction of the emergency vehicles, but also inside the cabin, coming from nowhere, everywhere. And she realized every exit was watched, every path controlled. The stewardess tried to calm herself, to stay grounded, to reach someone, anyone, but every movement caused the cabin to distort again, rows shifting, seats multiplying, overhead bins clicking open with empty force, as if testing weight, testing patience, testing fear.
A passenger in the back screamed, vanished mid-word, leaving only the seat warm, his belongings untouched but rearranged, and the crying moved to the front, higher now, closer, faster, intelligent, almost satisfied. She reached the front, emergency lights flashing red outside, but the plane itself seemed to lean slightly, subtly, impossibly, and she felt a brush against her shoulder, soft, patient, deliberate, and knew the entity was closer than ever, moving freely inside the cabin, inside the metal, inside the air, invisible but present, intimate, aware. She looked at the open doors, the ramp, the waiting crews, and knew leaving the plane meant nothing, because whatever had claimed it, whatever had been patient, hiding, studying, waiting since takeoff, was inside, and it didn't care about distance, about walls, about normal rules. The plane was alive with it, and anyone stepping outside was still within reach, still inside the horror, still being watched, studied, collected. And she realized the crying, the shadows, the whispers, the figures on the fuselage, the faces in the screens. They were all the same. One consciousness, patient, all-seeing, omnipresent. And there was no safe place, no comforting exit, only the illusion of safety, only the cold, heavy knowledge that the flight had landed, but whatever boarded had not left, and would follow, would wait, would claim, would watch, endlessly, silently. And the stewardess froze for a heartbeat, then ran into the aisle one last time, heart hammering, realizing she was already too late. And as the doors opened fully, lights spilling onto the tarmac, she heard the softest whisper, the last breath of the cabin itself. "We've been waiting for you."
Since that day, the plane was never used again. They forgot about it, left it on the tarmac. The crew listed as missing, never explained. The passengers moved on, but some couldn't shake the memories. Every time a plane flew overhead, a faint crying drifted in the wind. The airport never mentions that flight again, and sometimes, at night, the cabin lights flicker on that empty plane. Whatever boarded it didn't leave alone.